Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you about white blood cells. Okay, so just like we use the big boy terms for red blood cells was erythrocytes, when we're talking about white blood cells, we call them leukocytes. So leukocytes are your white blood cells, which will abbreviate WBC. Okay, so what is their main function? The abbreviation FCN is function, for those who don't know. Their main function is to fight infection. Right, as Jake would point out, like coronavirus. They're not doing a good job right now. Anyway, so because there are different types of infectious agents, we have different types of white blood cells that are going to tackle different types of infectious agents. So I'm going to give you the two classifications, broad classifications for these first, and then we're going to break down what each of them does. So all told, there are 5 classes of white blood cells. Again, all derived from our hematopoietic stem cell in your red bone marrow. So they're broken down into 2 general groups, and I'll explain why they're broken down this way in a minute. You have granulocytes, and then you have agranulocytes. Okay, granulocytes are called granulocytes because in their cellular cytoplasm, they have granules, and those granules are going to release different molecules, which we'll get to when we talk about which types and what they do. The agranulocytes are called that because their cytoplasm does not contain any granules, and so they're not going to be releasing chemicals per se that would fight a particular infectious agent. So we'll get to those in a minute. There are 3 types of granulocytes: neutrophils, basophils, and eosinophils. So the 3 phils are the granulocytes. The agranulocytes, there are 2, because remember there are 5 total, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay, are monocytes and lymphocytes. Okay, so all told, we have 5 classes. Some of them are going to perform similar functions, and then some will have very unique functions that we'll talk about as well. Each of these is going to be fighting infection. So that's very global, but it's the way that they go about it and perhaps the infectious agent that they're dealing with that kind of separates them out into different groups. Okay, I'm going to start with the granulocytes for no particular reason. Now, it's not each of the 5 classes is represented equally from a numbers perspective. It's not everybody's 20%. So if you look at the breakdown, you'd see that the neutrophils are the most dominant type of white blood cell, followed by the monocytes, and then there are small percentages of lymphocytes, and then basophils and eosinophils. Okay, so let's start with the neutrophils. Neutrophils act as macrophages. Okay, so in AMP1, you talked about cells that behave as macrophages. Okay, phage means to eat. Neutrophils will engulf and destroy other pathogenic substances. Okay, any very kind of general patrolling. I see something I don't like. It doesn't belong here, and I mark it for death, okay? These are the most dominant, about 65% roughly. I'm not a big numbers person, but it's the dominant. The majority of your white blood cells are neutrophils. And that should kind of make sense to you, because if they're kind of general warriors that spot things that are foreign and kill them, that's exactly what you want, right? A lot of kind of foot soldiers out there making sure that infectious agents really never get a strong immune reaction from you. So when someone has something like neutropenia, it means that their neutrophil count is exceedingly low. You can imagine then this is extremely dangerous because it opens you up to all sorts of bacterial infections and other types of infections. The neutrophils should kind of be taking care of that in the background, and now they're not anymore. Okay, basophils. Basophils, the granules, remember these are all the granulocytes. The granules inside of a basophil release a chemical called histamine, which is important during inflammatory reactions. Most of you are familiar with Benadryl, which will block the actions of histamine. It's an antihistamine. It also knocks you right out. Okay, eosinophils are probably my favorite. Oh, incidentally, that stuff they sell that you pay, it looks really pretty in a purple bottle. It's called ZzzQuil that they advertise as a non-addictive sleep aid. It's just Benadryl, same dose, but they add lavender to it to make it smell nice and maybe help you go to sleep. Eosinophils, those granules, specifically, they release chemicals that will kill parasitic worms. And you think, that's odd. We have a whole class of white blood cells that simply is designed to kill parasitic worms. Yes, we have to remember that now, we go on food, we go hunt and gather at a chop right. But years ago, early man would eat things that were potentially infested with other things like parasitic worms. And you wanted some sort of mechanism to kind of knock them out. And so this is the cell type that will actually knock out parasitic worms should they enter through ingestion or contact with water that has worms, etc. Okay, and then the agranulocytes. You have two types. You have monocytes. Okay, these also act as macrophages. And you think we need a whole other group of these? Yes, because again, you want as many foot soldiers on the ground trying to get rid of as many things as possible that you might come in contact with that are foreign. When we cover the immune system, we're going to go into a lot more detail about this, but for now, we'll just leave it as this. And then the last type are your lymphocytes. And this is where it gets kind of cool and special. Your lymphocytes are called such because they develop in your lymphatic organs, which when we cover the lymph system, you'll become more familiar with. So you have two types of these. So there's two subtypes. You have your B lymphocytes, which are sometimes just called your B cells. And then you have your T lymphocytes, which are sometimes just called T cells. So if you see B cell or T cell, that's short for a B lymphocyte and a T lymphocyte. These are a very important part of what's called your specific or your adaptive immunity. B lymphocytes are the cells that help us to produce antibodies. Okay, so again, we're going to talk about what antibodies are, how they're produced, etc. when we cover the immune system. T cells are involved in what's called cell-to-cell combat. They're part of your cellular immunity. And again, when we do the immune system, we're going to take a very deep dive into B cells and T cells. But T cells, just as kind of a interesting fact, these are the cells that actually are the preferred host for the HIV virus. Okay, so patients who have human immunodeficiency virus, that virus uses certain T cell populations as its host. So what happens when someone becomes infected with HIV is these T cells become compromised and they can't work anymore, which is why someone then would develop potentially AIDS. Okay, just as I did with the red blood cells, I'm going to give you an issue associated with white blood cells. Okay, so again, this is really broad, leukemia. Okay, so what happens when someone has leukemia? I want to start off by saying that there are different types of leukemia. There are 4 types that kind of dominate the landscape. Not all of them are equal. Some of them are acute types of leukemia. Those are a little more dangerous versus a chronic type of leukemia. Not that that's not dangerous, but the pattern of the way that the cell, how aggressive the cancer is really dictated by whether it's acute or chronic. So, to keep it really simple, leukemia means we have a cancerous line of white blood cells. Which type of cell and whether it's acute or chronic is going, it would really give us more direction here, but we're going to use very general terms, okay? When someone has leukemia, they would have an elevated white blood cell count. However, the cells are ineffective. So because of that, then the person who is affected by leukemia would still be immunocompromised. And their ability to fight infection would be challenged. Okay? Depending on the type of leukemia that an individual has will depend on how aggressively we treat it. So the treatments can range from a variety of different things. So you can treat with something like an oral chemotherapy, maybe a dose that someone takes every day or several times a week, and perhaps at a lower dose than IV chemo. In some cases, leukemia is addressed with a bone marrow transplant. But again, that of course has its challenges and its pitfalls. You would need to find an appropriate bone marrow donor first, of course, and then the success rate after transplant would then become a challenge for your patient, okay? All right, so the last thing that we have to talk about connected to the blood cells will be our platelets, okay? And again, just like we use the scientific term, we said erythrocyte and leukocyte, now we're gonna use the scientific term for platelets, and that's called thrombocytes. So now we see thrombosis. We're going to think about when someone has a DVT, what do they have? They have a clot. So thrombocytes, or platelets, will assist with blood clotting. Specifically, they will form a structure called the platelet plug. When someone has an injury, the platelet plug will arrive at the site of injury first just to kind of pull things together temporarily until a proper blood clot can be formed so that you are preventing blood loss, okay? When someone has a condition called thrombocytopenia, it means that they have a very low platelet count, which can mean that they will have difficulties with forming the platelet plug and would be slow to clot. The treatment for this is simply you would infuse platelets, okay, to the patient. Good? Now we're going to talk more about blood clotting in a few minutes, but we're just going to leave this as it is for the moment, okay? All right, so that wraps up the cellular pieces of blood. In our next video, we're going to tackle blood clotting and blood typing.